Our objective for Chapter 4 is to answer literal and inferential questions about medieval towns referencing your reader. You will also refer to examples from the text of medieval towns changing the way of life in the Middle Ages. As we look at Chapter 4, we see the big question is, how did the growth of trade during the Middle Ages affect the way that people lived? We're going to see a shift from chapters 1, 2, and 3 to a society that's changing and growing. And with that comes positive and negative aspects. So we're going to make a T-chart as we read this chapter together. You'll notice on page 28 that the author has put the words or the text into italics. And they did this because it's different from the rest of the text in the chapter. In the two paragraphs, the author is setting the scene to make you as the reader feel as if you are standing in a medieval town. It is raining again. You stand in a puddle on the edge of a narrow street. You have just entered town through one of the two gates. The gates are the only ways in and out of this walled town. Inside the walls, tiny townhouses stand side by side. As you move through the crowd, you spot rats scurrying about, feeding on discarded trash. Nearby, you hear the varied cries of people selling fruits, vegetables, eggs, and pies. It is market day, and people have set up their stalls in the town square. As you make your way through the muddy streets, you hear the sound of church bells. They ring out to sound the hour and to call people to church. You have just caught a glimpse of a town in Europe during the late Middle Ages. You'll see on the left side, metalworker's stall and medieval market, and streets in medieval towns were often crowded and muddy. Page 30. In the early part of the Middle Ages, most people lived in the countryside. Between the years 1000 and 1350 CE, which means Common Era, which is very similar to AD, which is Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord. Fueled by trade, towns began to grow. New jobs emerged, and as a result, more and more people left the countryside to live and work. So if you look right here, let's see if I can get mouse. Kind of want to highlight right here. You see the word as a result, right? That signals a cause and effect. So new jobs emerge, which means they came about, they're new. And then as a result, the effect of that is that more and more people left the countryside to live and work in towns. And if you remember in chapter 3, the lords controlled much of the countryside and the serfs farmed. And so that agriculture was their way of living. And now a new society thing is happening. It's their towns are starting to grow and get bigger, and now people are leaving their old way of life. So if you'll see here, peasants farming in the countryside, those are the serfs. With this growth in trade, an increased number of people became involved in commerce or business. As a context clue, commerce or business, they're giving you another word for it. As a result, you see again, cause and effect. A class of people called the middle class grew in importance. So because of trade, the middle class grew in importance. So now there's a new class. So remember the feudalistic system, the bottom is the serfs, and then you move up and you have the middle class, and then you have the church leaders, and then you have the king. So the serfs are starting to go up a little bit from the bottom to another class of people. Merchants and craftsmen were part of the middle class. Towns grew as the middle class created successful businesses and therefore jobs. Some merchants became rich and influential members of town communities. To protect their businesses, merchants established guilds in towns throughout Europe. Guilds were organizations made up of merchants. Guilds controlled wages as well as the price and quality of the goods the merchants sold. And you see merchants and artisans sold goods in towns, markets. So to keep track of what I'm reading, I'm going to minimize this. No. And go over here to my positive aspects and negative aspects. So far I've read on page 30 that new jobs emerged. Okay, and that enabled, let's see, the growth in trade. Enabled a new class to emerge called let's try the growth in trade enabled let's change that. Yeah. All right, so moving on, I'm gonna go back here. Okay, so as towns grew, I'm looking right here, specifically towns grew as the middle class created successful businesses and jobs. Merchants became rich and influential members of town communities. So I'm iffy on if the guilds are a negative aspect. Right here, it says to protect their businesses, merchants established guilds in towns throughout Europe. Guilds were organizations made up of merchants. Guilds controlled wages as well as the price and quality of the goods a merchant sold. I think it could be positive and negative. So right now I'm just going to put guild protected wages and the price of, well, price and quality sold. If it becomes negative, we'll erase it. All right, so let's move on to page, I didn't see anything negative on page 30, so I'm gonna go over here. And, all right, page 31. Not only did merchants thrive, so did skilled craftsmen such as carpenters, papermakers, glassmakers, and blacksmiths. Skilled craftsmen were also important members of town communities. They made and sold their goods in the towns in which they lived and worked. Just like merchants, skilled craftsmen protected their businesses by forming guilds. Only highly skilled craftsmen were invited to join these guilds. Many years of training went into becoming a skilled craftsman. There was a certain pattern to the daily life in towns in the Middle Ages. From Monday to Saturday, towns were busy with the hustle and bustle of street vendors, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and market sellers. Pickpockets and purse snatchers were afoot too. Shops opened as early as 6 a.m. Most towns held markets 2 or 3 times a week, and local farmers sold produce and animals. Right here, you see the medieval craftsman, carpenter, armorer, tailor, and tanner, and then a town scene and medieval manuscript. So coming back here, positive aspects. Let's see. Skilled craftsmen thrived and they were successful. I would say a negative aspect that I read right here. I said pickpockets and purse snatchers were afoot too, and those are thieves. So come on over here. And purse snatchers were afoot. Means they're roaming around. All right, page 32. Towns were not outside the control of the local lord. Merchants and craftsmen usually paid lords in the form of money or goods. However, in exchange for money or goods, many lords granted towns special charters. The charters allowed wealthy and influential townspeople the right to make their own laws. Over time, this new decision-making process changed the feudal system. So do you see how the lord is slowly giving away his power? If it changed the feudal system where the kings had all the power, now they're exchanging their power for goods and services. Remember that. That's a really important part of where this feudal system is about to go. So over here, I'm seeing, well, the local lord is sharing his power in exchange for goods and services. With a growing economy, a banking system began to develop. The increasingly wealthy churches and towns created schools called universities. Places such as Oxford and Cambridge in England and Paris in France became important centers of learning. That's awesome. So over here, I'm going to put positive aspects, universities established. Here you see charters such as the one from Bedford, England, outline certain rights, and then construction on the chapel at Oxford University's Merton College began in the 1200s. Page 33. It was not long before many European towns and cities became terribly overcrowded. People lived in small houses, crowded together. The towns and cities were also disease-ridden. Rats scurrying about helped spread disease. Unless you lived in a castle, you did not have a toilet inside your home. Instead, people used chamber pots and threw the contents into the street. That's pretty gross. And then rats spread disease in towns. Local water supplies, polluted with the waste that was discarded daily, carried disease. So the stuff, you know what stuff, they dumped in the streets was polluting their water that they drank and they bathed in. It carried disease. So they were getting sick. So this next sentence says, sickness and disease were common. The Black Death spread easily in such conditions. As they did in the countryside, people in towns cooked on small fires inside their homes. Fires frequently broke out and were difficult to control. Townspeople were required to keep buckets of water outside their homes just in case. And then you see here in this picture, it says fire spread quickly in medieval towns because their thatched roofs, remember, were made of hay. And so when it caught fire, it just spread like really easily from one house to another. Many Middle Ages towns were walled. People entering or leaving did so through gates. Think about Jericho. Often a toll or a fee was charged to enter a town. So you see context clues here, often a toll or a fee. If you didn't know what a toll was, they just told you it was a fee, something that you have to pay for to get in. A toll collector stood at the gate to collect the fee. The tolls were either paid in money or in goods. Gates were designed to keep criminals out or, if necessary, to lock criminals in so they could be caught. There was no organized police force, but instead there were watchmen. Any member of the public could be asked to help catch an escaping criminal. The town gates were locked at night when the curfew bell sounded. So if I'm going to go back to my T-chart, my positive aspects, when I took away from that page. The Black Death. Yuck. Okay. The Black Death emerged. Let's see, I'll make this bigger. Infected rats and unsanitary conditions, meaning they didn't have toilets and they dumped their stuff in the streets and it polluted their local water. All right, so going back, my text. All right, oh, frequent fires. And I'm going to put walled cities or walled towns for protection. That's a positive. Right, page 34. So right here, this gate leads into the town of Besalú, Spain, built in the 1100s. Originally, curfew bells rang to inform those in taverns that it was time to leave. However, they soon became a signal to everyone that it was time to go home. If you were an apprentice craftsman, right here you see a subheading that's going to tell you what this next few paragraphs is going to be about. Make it bigger. Just like the boys who go off to train to be knights, you too are sent away at an early age. Your family arranges your training. You must live in the home of a master or highly skilled craftsman. So a master is a highly skilled craftsman. You see or, it's a great context clue. They're just giving you another definition or another word for it. It is unlikely that you will return home again during your apprenticeship years. Your training will take many years to complete. You will not receive payment for any of the work that you do. During this time, you're part of your master's household. You live in his home or shop. You usually eat with his family. Your new family provides the clothes you wear. Even if you are homesick or sad, you have to obey your master. After a specified period of time, you advance from being an apprentice to becoming a journeyman. As a journeyman, you are paid by your master. Each day for your work, Usually, or each day for your work. Usually you continue to work for your master as an employee. After several years as an employee, you might take the next step in your career. You might be ready to submit a piece of your best work called your masterpiece to the guild for approval. If the guild accepts your work, you finally become a master, craftsman. You might even be able to open your own shop with your name above the door. So you see there's a order of operations. You are an apprentice, then you are a journeyman, and then you become a master. Okay, so you can't skip anything. You have to go through that process. So adding to my chart, I think it's a positive thing that you had people to train you. Positive aspect, skilled craftsmen were trained in an order that ensured success, right? So I say it ensured success, I'm inferring there because they're allowed to go to someone who's already skilled in their job. They're able to learn with them, live with them. They don't receive payment, but they're fed and clothed during that time. Okay, and then after their apprentice, where they're brand new, they become able to do some things on their own as a journeyman, and they continue to work for their master, and then they're paid. And then they finally are able to move away from their master and become their own master. Okay, and it's very similar to, I would say, teaching, and most jobs have an apprenticeship. So before you become a teacher, you have to be a student teacher, and it's much like an apprenticeship for a whole year. You are trained under a licensed teacher. They teach you what to do, and you're not paid. And then you're able to teach on your own. And then finally you become your own teacher. Now the journeyman part, it's not similar to that aspect, but you have to do a student teaching before you become a licensed teacher. And there are other jobs out there that are very similar. Page 36, women in the Middle Ages. Women in the Middle Ages had few legal rights. However, a small number of women in positions of power had significant influence. For example, women who became queens were often in a position to advise their husbands and sons, the kings and princes. A lord's widow who did not have sons could manage her deceased husband's land and make important decisions. Women could become skilled in a particular craft, and some trained to be merchants. Other women joined the church and became nuns. Many women worked alongside their husbands in the fields, regardless of whether they were part of the privileged class or were serfs. As important members of their households, women managed their families' daily needs. Two interesting women from this time period were Empress Matilda and Abbess Hildegard of Bingen. Empress Matilda lived during the 1100s and was the daughter of King Henry I of England. She was involved in leading an army against an English king. She escaped capture and went to France. She was also the mother of King Henry II of England. Abbess Hildegard was a writer and composer who lived during the 1100s. She wrote about many different subjects, including philosophy, science, and medicine. She also developed an alternative English alphabet. It's pretty awesome. So going back to page 36, just to remember what I wrote, I don't see anything super negative. I would say that women, well, okay, we'll put this. Women in the Middle Ages. I would say this is negative. I think I took more positive away from that because they had more rights than I think they let on. Women in the Middle Ages had few legal rights. If I'm looking at it, this page, I would say, okay, well, it says small number of women. So it's only talking about a small number of women in positions that had significant influence. Okay, so we'll put here, women of influence had significant power. Okay, so there's a distinction there. Women of power had those special rights, but there were very few of them. Okay, so now let's talk about why I did that. So if I think about that chapter, over here, my book. chapter 4 in the merchants, I was just taking notes about the positive and negative aspects because it's going to be an important part of moving forward, distinguishing like we did with the lords and the serfs, like finding the difference in two things on the same topic. So looking at the merchants, all of that, think about what was positive about that time and what was negative. So we put new jobs emerged, the growth in trade enabled a new class called the middle class. The towns grew as the middle class created successful businesses and jobs, and merchants became rich and influential members of town communities. Guilds protected wages and the price and quality of goods sold. Skilled craftsmen thrived. Local lords started sharing their power in exchange for goods and services. Universities are established. Walled towns were for protection. Skilled craftsmen were trained in an order that ensured success, and women of influence had significant power. And on the flip side, the negative in that chapter was pickpockets and purse snatchers were afoot. Black death emerged from infected rats and unsanitary conditions, frequent fires, and women in the Middle Ages had few legal rights. If we keep track of this in our notes and we continue to do T-charts in each chapter, we'll find the most important information that kind of goes back to our big question and then our timeline period, because in social studies, which really this is part of social studies, we see that timelines can be so convoluted or so rich with a lot of detail that it's hard to distinguish what's important and what's not, okay? So this is the most important points from this chapter, the positive and negative aspects of what's going on. And that goes back to our objective. I'll share this T-chart with you, but going back the very beginning, when I told you that you were going to reference the text to answer literal and inferential questions, because you were going to do activity, let me see what I told you to do, 5.2, which is right here, which you'll have to use your text, and you can also use the T-chart, okay? So the first question, I'm going to model a few questions for you, and then you're going to do the rest on your own, and you should be able to write on this with the Kami app. So all I did was come here and put a text box, right? I'm going to draw it out. This should be able to write in it. The first question, well, excuse me, the directions say, as you and your partner read, but you don't have partners because we are distance learning, answer the following questions about chapter 4. Okay, it says, where did most people live in the early part of the Middle Ages, and where did some people move between 1000 CE and 1300 CE? I can remember from my notes right here, new jobs emerged, and I remember that because the town started popping up. So my notes have already helped me. I want to go back to my book here. Go back to page 30 because I remember that was at the beginning. I went too far. No, I didn't. Yeah, I did. Page 30. All right, it said, in the early part of the Middle Ages, most people lived in the countryside. So the question says, where did they live in the first part? There's the same word. In the early part of the Middle Ages, right there, the same word, right there, lived in the countryside. So it gave me the answer, but that's the first part. Oops. Let's see, most people lived in the countryside. Remember, they lived on manors. On manors. And then they moved. Let's see what the text says. They moved, double checking. Between the years 1000 and 1350 CE, fueled by trade, towns began to grow. So they moved to towns. And then so let's keep going. New jobs emerged, and as a result, more and more people left the countryside to live and work in towns. There we go. There's my answer. That's a very literal question, which means it's explicitly in the text. Then they moved to towns. And I found that on page 30. Okay. Let's look at the second one. How did trade change between, how did trade change where and how people lived during the Middle Ages? Let's go back to page 30. Look. It said how did it change and where and how people lived. Let's look for the words change. Let's look for talking about living. I'm going to say it's kind of right here too. New jobs emerge, and as a result, more people left the countryside to live and work in towns. Let's keep going. Merchants and craftsmen. Towns grew as the middle class created successful businesses and therefore jobs. So it's inferential, right? So it's not explicitly in the text. I can't just pull the same words out, but I can look for similar words and I can look for the topics, okay? So we know trade. So when they're trading, they have to be in the towns because they're with other people who are skilled craftsmen. So carpenters trade with armorers or tailors or tanners. They all trade with each other. So that created jobs, and the people were leaving the countryside into those towns so they could trade. I hope that made sense. Let me write it down. So trade led merchants to create more jobs. So some people moved off manors and into town. Because you remember a serf couldn't do anything but work for the Lord. They didn't have any power. But if they became a merchant and moved to the town and they had a skill, a particular skill, they could become a merchant and then sell their trade. So for example, if they were a tailor and they sewed people's clothes and they knew how to do that, they could not be a serf anymore, move to the town, offer their services as a tailor, which made them a merchant because they're selling their services in exchange for, it could be armor, they could exchange for somebody else's services, or they could get paid, which is huge. So that's where the serfs became another class. So let me insert a text box here, and I found that also on page 30. Okay, so continuing. All right. So you see how this one's very literal. It was in the text, almost verbatim, I'm a word for word. And this one's inferential. It wasn't exactly word for word in the text, but from your background knowledge and from reading, you can infer that they created more jobs. And so that's why they were moving off of those manors.